Hi, this is Gary Meese with the Case Against podcast, all about the West Memphis 3 case, which involved Damian Echols, Jason Baldwin, Jesse Miskelly Jr.'s murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers on May 5th, 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas. Briefly, the three men were convicted. They served about 18 years for the crimes and were eventually released in 2011. The chapter I'm reading this week out of my book, Blood on Black, is called "One of the Guys Had a Devil-Worshipping Book and We Would Go Buy It." I have two other books. Blood on Black's the first of two volumes on the case that goes into in depth about the case. The second book is Where the Monsters Go. I revised, condensed, and did some other editing for a smaller, somewhat more affordable book called The Case Against the West Memphis 3 Killers. All three books are available on Amazon in Kindle format and also in print. The area we're looking at this week involves yet another dubious statement from a pretty sketchy character. However, I think it does illuminate some aspects of the circumstances surrounding the crime. It's certainly worth knowing about and reading if you've got a deep interest in the case. It's also just bizarre enough to be worth reading on its own. This is a short chapter. It's not going to be a long episode, and I'm not suggesting that this in any way is some sort of damning proof against Damian Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly Jr. I certainly, if this person had testified, of course, we don't know exactly what he would have said on the stand, but, you know, I don't know how good a witness he would have been to begin with. Alvis Clem Bly, and furthermore, I don't really know that he would have anything that would, you know, have worked greatly toward convicting them. However, I will say again, it's certainly worth reading, and he's a little older than some of the other people we've quoted, mostly a lot of teenage acquaintances of Damian Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelly. Last week we had Ricky Clymer tell his version of various satanic rites that were going on in Crittenden County, Arkansas back in 1993 when this case was ongoing. And so this illuminates some other aspects of that. Self-confessed Satanist in trouble with the law became a prime source of information in the case. Alvis Clem Bly, 36, had been charged with sexual abuse first degree in March 1993 and was still in Crittenden County Jail when Detective Mike Allen talked to him on June 29th, 1993 about his involvement in the local witch cult. So once again, we have somebody who's accused of sexual crimes involved on the periphery of this case, which all the indications are that there was sexual abuse involved in the attacks on Stevie, Michael, and Chris. The exact details of that are a little uncertain simply because Jesse Misskelley, well, he consistently described sexual abuse. He changed it somewhat as it went along, mitigated it somewhat, toned it down a bit, but in some ways arguably made it worse. In other words, the more accurate he was, seemingly accurate, rather than just describing a wholesale rape rampage, when he got into more nuanced versions of what happened later on, in some ways it sounded almost worse than what he had originally said. The boys had bruising around the ears. It indicated their ears had been held while they were forced to commit sex acts, which sounds bizarre, but apparently that's something that happens in these kind of sexual abuse cases. There were also indications around the buttocks that there had been some sort of interaction going there of some sort. Whether it involved actual penetration or not is questionable. And that's what Misskelley originally described. However, it's quite possible he saw what looked to be full-scale penetration, but was actually something somewhat less than that, but still just as perverted, disgusting, against the law, and against all sense of human dignity, and is absolutely inexcusable. I think a lot of people would think that people who commit these kind of acts probably deserve the death penalty just on that basis alone. And I'm not a big fan of the death penalty simply because it's applied so unevenly. However, I'm not really against the idea that sexual abusers certainly need to be kept out of society. And if the only means of doing that is putting them to death, then it's certainly better than them being out abusing little boys and girls. Personally, I just prefer that they get locked up and stay that way. Maybe on their own little island where they can just abuse each other. Anyway, Alvis Glenn Bly at times seemed almost incoherent while nonetheless giving details that concurred with other statements. Bly had lived on East Barton in West Memphis in the neighborhood of the victims and in Lakeshore Trailer Park, which is where Baldwin and Damien's girlfriend Dominique Tier lived, and where Damien spent a great deal of his time. Bly had lived there also prior to being arrested. He had been involved in the cult for about a year. About 20 people, never less than 8 were involved, according to Bly. Quote, "We always had a certain time to meet out there during the week. We always go on Sunday," unquote, at 6 o'clock in the evening. Quote, "It was in the book that's what time you're supposed to start it." Now, according to the most commonly used text among these young local witches, Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, most covens meet once a week, but there really is no hard and fast rule. That's according to Buckland. There was a little agreement among professed occultists talking to police about meeting times. Bly explained, "Well, we just go out there and one of the guys had a devil-worshipping book and we would go by it, which was sacrificing dogs or chicken. We would drain their blood, then we would take and cut the heart out and put it in the center of the pentagram and set fire to it and worship the devil." Bly described the pentagram as a, quote, devil symbol placed on the floor. They had some chalk, some white powder chalk, and some blue chalk like carpenter's chalk, and would draw with that. Bly, who had been following the case in the news, named Misskelley and Baldwin as participants. This is all very strange. He names Misskelley and Baldwin, but not Eccles as participants. And it gets a little stranger here. He said cult members called Baldwin Davian. Mike Allen got out a newspaper with the story about the killings and photos of the three suspects. Allen. Okay, is this the one they call Damien? Presumably pointing to a picture of Damien. Well, we'll find out who's actually pointing to. Bly, no, sir. Allen, I'm pointing to Jason Baldwin. Okay, he was pointing to Baldwin. Bly, I see. That's not Davian. The other boy was Damien. I don't see him on the... There he is. That's Davian there. Allen, okay, that's the one they call Damien there. Yes, Bly, yes, sir. Allen, Davian, whatever you name him as. Bly, Davian, that's devil name. Oh, Allen, okay, and this is the person you know as Baldwin? Bly, yes, sir. Allen, point to a picture of Jason Baldwin and this person here. Do you recognize him? Bly, he's the leader. Misskelley is. Now, clearly, Jesse Misskelley was not the leader of the local witch cult. Not even close. And Allen's response is, okay, Bly, all I know is Jason or Jess or Jesse, something like that. I'm not sure. If you're confused, maybe I am too. I'm just quoting what's said here. It seems that Bly did not do a really great job of identifying these guys. He doesn't really seem to be clear about their names, etc. Bly named locations for cult activities such as an old red barn behind Lakeshore, a huge empty house out on Highway 50 North, and a shed behind a house on Rich Road in West Memphis. Bly claimed he had had a ski boat and had taken Misskelley down to Hernando Point in Mississippi the previous summer, which seems strange since he seems to have been uncertain about Misskelley's first name. Bly, I don't know how he brought it up, but I used not to believe in the Bible or the Lord, and he asked me if I was atheist, and I told him yes, and that's how I come about getting in it. He told me that the devil would give me more than God ever would. Allen asked about illegal activities within the group. Bly, killing the dogs is illegal to start with because we would steal the dogs from people, and that rape where they raped that girl out there, I know that was illegal. He said the rape of a girl who was a member of the cult occurred at this local structure called Stonehenge, which was an abandoned and otherwise dilapidated cotton gin. I mean, basically it was a bunch of big concrete pillars. Ricky Clymer had mentioned a rape, who was in the episode last week, had mentioned a rape as part of a hanging ritual. Bly, well, Misskelley came up with the idea of it, and then Baldwin went along with it. Baldwin was the first one that raped her, which she kind of went along with, but when the other guy started doing it, she had a fit about it, said she would tell. He named a 16-year-old who lived in Lakeshore as the victim. She apparently was never interviewed, which, you know, there are criticisms of the police that get thrown around, and I concur with some of those criticisms. I don't think they did a terrible job. I don't think they did a great job, and obviously there are a lot of people, some people they talk to, you sort of wonder why did they waste their time, and there are other people that they didn't talk to and didn't record the interviews, and you wonder why they didn't talk to them, including the parents. It would have been good to have recorded interviews of all the parents, not because any of them were implicated in the crimes, but just simply to get more background and understanding of the boys, who they may have known, who their friends were, if they'd known who, maybe there's some other boys who had gone out into these woods where they were found after having gone missing. Well, maybe there would have been some other little boys that have also gone out there at different times who could maybe give them some more information. They spent quite a bit of time interviewing there were many interviews of one friend, Aaron Hutchinson, who started right off with a very dubious description of events on May 5th, 1993, and just sort of went on from there, seemingly making stuff up to the point that it was difficult to tell if any of what he was saying was fantasy, had any kind of reality at all, if it was all sheer fantasy, or if there were some basis for the idea that they had actually seen some rituals going on out there. Maybe if they'd talked to some other little boys, they might have, who were friends, who either saw this or heard this from the three boys that were killed, that perhaps we would have gotten a better idea of what was actually going on. And this is a good example of a case where they had the name of a girl in the lakeshore, and if there was actually a rape there, which seems to be something that would draw their attention, seems like they go talk to her, but they didn't, and I don't understand that. I don't understand why they didn't do a much better interview with, say, Dixie Hufford. Since L.G. Hollingsworth, there were a lot of questions about his activities, and she was somewhat central to not only that, but also to the Hollingsworth family sighting. Instead, we get a very perfunctory and unsatisfactory interview with Dixie Hufford. Those are some easy examples. There are others. Back to Alvin Bly. Stonehenge, he said, was, quote, the only place we sacrificed dogs at. How we do the dogs, we beat them to death first with sticks, and they were alive when we hung them up. We would beat them to death over the top of the pentagram. The pentagram would be drawn on the floor right under where we hung the dog up. We would hang the dog up above that, and then we would cut his throat, his thing, and we would catch the blood in a pail. And then we drank a cup full apiece of the blood, and then we would cut his head off. Then we would cut him open and cut his heart out. We would put the heart in the middle of this and pour alcohol on it and mixed with baby oil. We had a pie pan we would set in the center of this, which is the same thing I'm talking, we got the blood in it. And then we would put the baby oil on the heart and, burn it. It wouldn't burn it up, but it would burn it. And then we would praise to the devil and stuff. And now, according to Bly, the dogs were tied up by the hind legs. Everybody had to hit the dogs, everybody. If you didn't hit him, you had to leave. Bly said he would have expected the boys who were killed to have been beaten with sticks, which certainly seems to be the case. There are wounds, a pattern of wounds, really. It's a very similar pattern of blows to the top of the heads of all three boys that have, among other things involved in the deaths, had a ritualistic aspect. What looked like 3 sharp blows to the head with a large stick. There were sticks that were gathered from the scene. Eccles was also known to carry around a large stick. In fact, there was a large such stick found at his home after the killings. Kind of a wizard's wand, according to, I guess he thought he was the black magic version of Gandalf or something. I'm not sure what was... I have an idea what was going on in Eccles' head, and it was not a pretty picture, but if you... Any movie you've seen with an evil wizard in it, that's probably pretty much what Eccles thought of himself. The guy he wanted to be. He wanted to be the bad guy. He wanted to be the evil but powerful wizard. I'm guessing, but there's no indication that I'm wrong. Back to Bly. They would have raped them usually. Like I say, I don't know why they didn't cut their heads off, because you're supposed to. If you've done that, you're supposed to cut their heads off. We cut all the dogs' heads off. We would hand the head up, and do away, throw the body down it in a big ditch there by Stonehenge. Now, this was a rare mention of disposing bodies in a ditch, and a ditch is where the bodies of Chris, Michael, and Stevie were disposed of, except they weren't bodies. At the time, Chris had bled out from being emasculated by Jason Baldwin with a knife, and all three of them had been beaten to the point that they almost certainly wouldn't have survived those wounds, to the head in particular. There were a lot of cuts to Stevie and to Chris, other cuts, but Michael and Stevie drowned after being stomped into the mud of this muddy little ditch in what is known as Robin Hood Hills. So there were bodies disposed of in a ditch in the killing as well. Alan asked, any other body parts they might cut off? Bly, their penis, bite it off. That's what it reads in the book to do, devil circumcision. There's nothing in Buckland's book that suggests anything like this, so I'm not suggesting that that's the book. Again, that seemed to be the book most of them were using, but that's not necessarily the book that this particular group were using. And no, the penises weren't bitten off. A lot of talk about bite marks in this case. There's not really any indication of human bite marks, despite what some say. There is a mark on Stevie Branch's brow that's often attributed to a bite mark. It's almost perfectly round. It's got a little X mark in the center, and that mark almost perfectly corresponds to the mark that the bottom of the hilt of a Rambo knife would make if it was slapped into your head. A Rambo knife, very similar, if not the same, as the Rambo knife found in the lake behind Jason Baldwin's house. A Rambo knife that both Jason Baldwin was known to have, and that Damien Eccles' girlfriend, Deanna Holcomb, said that he carried around all the time. And there's no doubt that Baldwin and Eccles both were knife collectors. Now, Bly was talking about biting the penis off as a devil circumcision. Mike Allen says, what did they do this dog? Bly, no sir, it wasn't nobody had the courage to do it to the dogs. We would cut their penis off, but they wouldn't bite off like you were supposed to. Imagine that. Bly, Skelly always had the knife he carried on his side all the time. It's a hunter's knife. It had a wrapped leather handle. It had a can opener. It come out, and it was swiveled down the top like a little saw deal. It sounds something like a Swiss Army knife. The blade had, quote, ripples in it. It called a gut knife. Now, Bly said the knife was about 11 inches total length. Well, that doesn't sound like a Swiss Army knife, but some of these attachments do. It's called a bleeder, what it is, gut knife. Well, I couldn't remember what was said in the ceremony. We read it out of a book that we got from the library here. He described the book as The Devil Something. Black, shiny black, about 100-page book. It's got like a dragon with like a goat's body, quote unquote, on the cover. I don't know which book. This is not Buckland's book, so I don't know what book this is. I've tried to find something like this, and I haven't. I've done some searching, and maybe it's just easy to find, and I was just incompetent, but I just have not seen this particular book. It was St. Lucifer's second son. It was Satan on the front. That's who it was. Alan asked about Damien Eccles' role in all this. Bly. Well, we took turns. Sometimes he would cut the heart out. Sometimes I would, or Miss Kelly, or any of the other people. We spread it out different times. Every who didn't do it the last time would have to do it that time. Bly said that when he left the cult, they were discussing the sacrifice of children. Quote, they were trying to pick out, wanted to know who we would pick out to do it to. I was already leaving the cult anyway because they raped that girl. This was about a month before the boys got killed. They were planning on sacrificing them up here on 50 at that house and leave them there. Okay. That's pretty much everything from Alvis Clem Bly. Another Bly, Charlotte Ann Bly Beloy, or Blois, Bolois. I would say Beloy, but who knows how they pronounce it, of Parkin, met with West Memphis Detective Brian Ridge at the First Baptist Church in Parkin, Arkansas on October 13th, partially to describe to him the site of a satanic ritual in Crittenden County. She said that someone named Chris from either the small community of Lehigh in Crittenden County or from Paris, Tennessee, and Greg Wilson, quote, from quote, somewhere in Alabama, unquote, had set up the ritual site close to Shell Lake, which is about a mile and a half out in the woods south of Earl. Ridge, who had been to the site, said it was east of 149 Highway. Quote from Charlotte M. Bly Beloy. There's a bunch of tarpaulin up there now, and then there was just an old green rag tent. She said these men were staying with Amy and Eddie Wilson, who were relatives of Muskelly confidant Buddy Lucas. She said she went to the site with Chris and Greg in September of 1992. Ridge asked, okay, what was taking place when you go there? They were doing a bunch of devil worshipping, talking silly, she said. They was huffing gas and glue and everything else they could find. They got the glue out Eddie's shop back there. Ridge, okay, you got upset, I understand? Boy, yes. Ridge, okay, did anything else occur, or was there anything told to you that's what they were doing, devil worshipping? Charlotte Ann, I'm going to give up on guessing what her last name is, how her last name's pronounced. I seen Greg turned into something silly. I don't know what it was, but it was some kind of animal. Now, her reference was unclear, and Ridge did nothing to clarify what she was talking about. I think we can make a reasonable assumption that this Greg fellow had been imitating some sort of animal. Ridge, okay, now Greg has told you he has did something with an animal out there, is that correct? Charlotte Ann, he killed one of Amy's dogs. It's supposed to have been a sacrifice. Now, Charlotte Ann was cousin to Buddy Lucas and knew Damien from school. She said this about Eccles. He's a weird person. I know he uses drugs and he's a devil worshiper. I know that much. He asked me if I was a devil worshiper, and I said no. He said, well, you're hanging around one. That's exactly what he said. And she had lived at Lakeshore and had never heard of any devil worshipping there. But she said devil worshipping had continued at Shell Lake since her visit And she also said Buddy Lucas had gone to the site with Chris and Greg Wilson on Halloween of 1992. Brian Ridge observed, Halloween should be a big night for devil worshiping. Now, in the Mid-South, that time of year is a welcome respite from oppressive summer heat. There are lots of community festivals. School football games are well attended. Nighttime becomes pleasantly cool. Damien Echols has called Halloween his favorite holiday, so Ridge's conjecture about a holiday being a big night for devil worshiping is based somewhat on that, I think, but also it is one of the larger occult holidays. Like October, May in the Mid-South is a distinctive time of year, being a relatively warm but pleasant climate before the summer heat arrives in June. Along with the end of the school year, there are many outdoor activities and festivals. May is not a month easily mistaken for another in West Memphis and Marion, Arkansas. Both months are prime time for witch cults. The disjointed and otherwise suspect accounts of Alvis Bly and Ricky Clymer, the chap from last week, despite obvious problems, offered further evidence that witch cults were alive and thriving in Crittenden County in 1992, 1993. And that's the end of the chapter. Now, I have all sorts of problems with that, and I think that it's pretty obvious why. There also seems to be an element of truth running through there. I'm just not sure exactly what it was. I'm not sure why Bly would be just simply making this stuff up. I mean, he was in jail. Maybe he was hoping for a deal. But I don't see how admitting to being involved in all this would necessarily get him anything in particular. And he didn't say anything that incriminated Miskelly, Echols, and Baldwin in the actual crime. He describes some rituals that they were involved in, and does so in such a poor way that it's actually often hard to figure out who he's even talking about as being involved in this. However, Miskelly also described sacrificing dogs in his initial confession. And maybe Bly was building on that somewhat, but there were sites around, there had been some sites around Crittenden County, the West Memphis area, they've been found over the previous 18 months to a year, 18 months to 2 years, that were looked like some sort of animal sacrifices had been conducted. The old Dab school that eventually burned down had one room that had chalk markings that were occult in nature. And, these are vandals, are kids coming in. And they could be doing almost anything for a lark. But it does raise a question. Jerry Driver, the youth detention officer who was heavily involved in the case, was very concerned what he was finding among the kids there with this interest in the occult. He gets demonized, no pun intended, he gets demonized for his belief that Echols posed a danger to society as a result of these beliefs. Indications are that he was a danger to society because of his beliefs, though if he didn't have these beliefs, he probably would still be a danger to society, because that is just the way he's wired. However, he had latched onto his occult beliefs at an early age, and they gave him a perfect outlet for working out his obsessions with power, with sex, with control, with things like bondage. He had a fascination with the Salem witch trials, describes a childhood in which he was going to sleep with visions of the Salem witch trial tortures going through his head. And of course he describes this as something that horrified him, and perhaps they did, but clearly it also fascinated him. And you've got this adrenaline charge going there, in which sex and violence and control are all tied up together in an insane mind. According to his own descriptions on his Social Security disability benefits application, in which he described himself as homicidal and suicidal, a sociopath, etc. When you got that kind of mind with those kind of influences and the means of working them out, and with the imagined possibility of actually getting away with it, and then continuing to commit a crime later on, and then perhaps turning yourself in for the notoriety, which seems to be what Echols was planning. I mean, he said as much. He was planning on killing some more people, some more kids, maybe some girls this time, and then turning himself in. Now, would he have turned himself in after the second killings? Probably not. Why would he do that? The only reason he would be for the notoriety. And if there were a second set of killings with 2 or 3 girls, or little boys, or whatever he happened to find, would he stop? Doesn't seem that likely, does it? One more set of killings after that, and he becomes a serial killer by definition. So we may well have had a case where there was a serial killer in the making who was just so profoundly over the top in his initial crimes, and was stupid enough to believe he was smart enough to get away with basically hiding in plain sight, actually bragging at some points at the softball game about having been involved, having committed the killings, talking about with various friends about his involvement in the killings, and yet he thought he could somehow get away with it. And the truth is, if Jesse Misskelley, if there hadn't been the Vicky Hutchison, Jesse Misskelley connection, in which the police, because of Vicky Hutchison deciding to play detective, making this contact with Damien Echols through her friend, Jesse Misskelley, and then the police becoming interested in Jesse Misskelley as maybe somebody who might have some information on Damien Echols. He wasn't high on the list. It was almost a month after the killings that they talked to him. They brought him in. They didn't know he was going to confess to the crimes, and that wasn't on the agenda. There were a lot of people who were much higher on the list as potential suspects. I mean, there's several lists that were out, and very soon after the crimes, people who might either know something about this or actually be involved. Misskelley's name doesn't appear on those. So he was not somebody that they would have picked out as, well, this is the guy to go to. Let's coerce him into a confession, which didn't happen. And then he'll implicate his friend Damien Echols. I mean, there were people who were much more likely to, on the surface, who seemed much more likely to become involved in this kind of crime, including Echols and Baldwin by his association with Echols. And make no mistake, just because he's just his best friend, well, you have to raise the question. Why would an otherwise seemingly normal boy make friends with the weirdest kid in town, someone who was obsessed with horror movies, who was constantly making jokes about things like cutting people's heads off, going around talking about himself as being the son of Satan and a devil worshiper. And perhaps it's quite likely that some of this, I'm sure some of it was just for attention, because he loved attention then. He loves attention now. His activities now are all about him, his occult practices, and look at me, look how I'm dressed, look at my tattoos, look at my strange hairstyles, look what I got away with, and look what I can do now. But why would Baldwin associate with such a person? Well, Baldwin associated with such a person because Baldwin is much more like that than it might appear on the surface. For one thing, he doesn't seem to have any form of conscience whatsoever. He's a very cool and practiced liar. He, for all the talk of Eccles is a self-admitted sociopath. And I think he's probably more correctly diagnosed as a pathological narcissist with some severe personality disorders beyond that. Baldwin's probably a lot simpler and a lot closer to that particular self-diagnosis of Eccles than Eccles is. In other words, Eccles might not have much of a conscience, but perhaps he's got something lodged back there somewhere. Not much sign of it, but there's really no sign that Baldwin really cares about anything but Baldwin. He makes a show of being involved in activism for prisoners, the wrongly accused. I'm still waiting to see any evidence he's actually doing anything with his proclaimed justice organization except collecting money to support the lifestyle of Jason Baldwin. If anybody come up with any information otherwise, let me know about it. I have an email address, GaryMeese@gmail.com. If you've got and I realize, believe me, I may be maybe I'm deluded about how many people even listen to this. But, if you've got a question about the case or you have information about the case, feel free to send it to me. Feel free, but I'm really challenging people to come up with any information about Jason Baldwin's organization doing anything other than collecting money for Jason Baldwin. And occasionally showing up when a high-profile prisoner, gets out of jail, he sort of stands in the background somewhere with a smile on his face as if he had something to do with it. Compared to Eccles, at least gives his followers what they're asking for. He writes kind of generic, not particularly well done books on magic, but they are what they are, and he does produce them, and if that's what you value, then you get what you paid for, and you shouldn't really have any complaints about that if you're foolish enough to spend money on that. With Baldwin, you get a guy who went on Kickstarter 5 years ago asking for money so he could finish his memoirs. He got $30,000. And 5 years later, there's still no memoir. What happened there? Where's the money, Jason? I don't expect accountability from Kickstarter because, it's the sort of thing that just lends itself to that kind of scam. But, when you promise something within a year and it's 18 months later, well, okay, it's a little delayed. 2 years later, well, it took a little longer than I expected. But 5 years later, the memoir's not going to happen. And certainly the $30,000 that people forked out, they weren't expecting to wait 5 years to get a return on their investment. Not that it's going to be worth anything anyway. It's all going to be Jason Baldwin talking about his life in the slave fields of Arkansas and all this other ridiculous stuff, the lingo he's picked up from people like Ava DuVernay, who did the ridiculous Central Park 5 Netflix docudrama that totally distorts the record on that and builds up all this sympathy for not just those 5 guys, but there were a number of other young men, teens who were involved in these attacks, and possibly the rape too. But certainly there were a number of other young men involved in viciously attacking people in Central Park for no reason other than they could, and because they were white. Let's go get some white people, mess around with them, beat them up, steal their money. That'll be great fun. Really, it's not so different than what Echols and Baldwin and Misskelley did when Jason and Damien invited Jesse to come along with them earlier in the week. They said, let's go Wednesday, let's go over to West Memphis, Arkansas and beat up some boys. And that sounded like a great idea to Jesse Misskelley Jr. That's enough free associating for me for this week. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next week with perhaps a longer podcast and probably something more substantive. I do think the story of Alvis Klimbye is interesting. With all the problems involved in it, it's still interesting because I do think something was going on there. However exaggerated and however bizarre and however out of touch his own descriptions are, there was something going on there, and I have no reason to think that Damien and Jason Baldwin were involved. I have really no reason to think Misskelley wasn't involved. I tend to think he was on the periphery of all this. This was all for him. This was just an excuse to be a goof, to drink, and to beat up people. Which is, it seems to summed up his existence in many ways besides him and his own 12 or 13-year-old girlfriend. But anyway, that's it for this week. Thank you.